Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, the biggest and costliest government inquiry this country has ever done has finally been released.
The Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry has found at least 200,000 people have been abused in state and faith-based care since 1950.
The final Royal Commission of Inquiry report, nearly 6 years in the making, has just been released. Children, young people and adults were exposed to extreme physical, emotional and sexual abuse, severe exploitation and neglect.
After years of demands.
Well, the Human Rights Commissioner, Dame Susan Devoy, has called for an inquiry into the historical abuse of children who were mistreated in state care.
Finally, in 2018, the government agreed.
Today, we are announcing that the inquiry into historic abuse in state care will be a royal commission.
And over the next few years, as the commission did its work, the nation heard harrowing stories.
The Royal Commission into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care has today heard from a man so affected by abuse that he set fire to his sleeping father and later in life killed the man in revenge for his hurt.
A report into the infamous Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital has found a great many of the children who went there did not have mental illnesses and should never have been there in the first place.
In the 1970s, children in the institution were abused through the use of electroconvulsive therapy under the guise of treatment.
Now the final report is here. 3,000 pages covering the abuse of some 200,000 people and what should be done about it. Aaron Smale is a freelance journalist who's covered this for 8 years. I asked him how he feels now he's got his hands on the report.
A lot of conflicting emotions, actually. I mean, you get this folder of PDFs and these 16 volumes. Where do you start?
Can you give me the long and short about what this is all about first? Just a brief summary of what we're talking about here and what's been released.
So the final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care is the final document from an inquiry that's been going on for 5 years. There's been interim reports that have come out during that period on different case studies and institutions. Lake Alice was one of them, Maryland School. There was also a report on redress, which I guess you could say it was about the lack of redress and why that wasn't happening as it should. Yeah. So there's been a lot of information that has been slowly been emerging. You know, there's been hearings, public hearings, where victims and experts and people in the public service have had to front up and give evidence around some key themes. And so it's been a very long process for everyone involved, and the deadline kept shifting because of the magnitude of it. And so here we are. This is the final report that is, I guess, the big document that is pulling it all together.
Okay, so we've got this huge report, right? What's in it? What are we looking at? How big is it?
Yeah, as I say, 16 volumes. Some of the volumes are shorter than others. There's about, 5 case studies, I think. And then you've got, at the front end, you've got the sort of key findings, and then I think it's about 138 recommendations of what the government should be doing.
Okay, big deal. Okay, can we just go over those 5 case studies? What are they? What are those places?
I mean, Jehovah's Witness, that's one.
Well, a legal bid by the Jehovah's Witness Church to get out of being part of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care has been dismissed by the High Court in Wellington.
So that each of them is looking into how these institutions or programs were run and why children were being abused in there and some of the outcomes and ramifications of that.
Another case study was Whakapakari.
A man who suffered extreme physical and psychological violence while staying at a social welfare-approved camp on Great Barrier Island in 1998 is now unable to work due to a post-traumatic stress. At 12 years old, Scott Carr was sent to Whakapakari by his social worker with the support of his parents after being told the camp was just what he needed, as it supposedly provided a lot of outdoor activities.
One of the things that stood out to me in that report, it said that that program was still being funded even for a good 20 years, even though people knew that there was terrible abuse going on, it carried on being funded.
There's also a third case study into 2 schools for deaf children. But Aaron's looked the most at what's been happening near his hometown of Levin. The other case studies are all around there.
I don't know what was going on in Levin at the time, because Hokianga Beach School, which was like a welfare institution for junior kids, and then you had Kohitere, which was for the older kids, was also in Levin. And then you had Kimberley, which was for the intellectually and physically disabled. There was a report, I think, some initial hearings that uncovered some of what had happened at Kimberley. And yeah, even, I'm pretty battle-hardened to hearing some of this stuff, but that was off the charts, awful. From the victims I've spoken to, there was often an escalation. If a kid was being abused and they ran away, they were just regarded as being naughty. There was no real investigation into why they were running away. And so things would escalate and they'd get sent up the road to the next institution. Kohitere and that sort of framework was kind of the end of the road. They were all awful, but yeah, there was some pretty nasty stuff. Some of the buildings at Kohitere are still standing, and I've visited there periodically. It's unnerving, really. There's a block right down the end. They call it the secure block, but it's basically a prison. There's victims I know that were in solitary confinement for periods of 3 months. There's one guy I know went in and did a stint of 5 months. These are kids. There's rules around that in prisons. You can't do that. And so these are the kinds of abuse there were, I know, certainly in the 70s and into the 80s, particularly Hokianga Beach School. There's probably about 3 paedophiles I could name who were abusing children. One of them was a guy by the name of Michael Ansell. He was the cook. He actually had convictions for abusing children before he even got the job. And it wasn't long before he started preying on children in the institution, and then eventually got kicked out. But there were many that were simply moved on, and there was nothing really done about it.
5 case studies, so they make up quite a bit of the report. But then we've also got, as you say, 138 recommendations. That's a lot of recommendations, and I don't expect you to tell me all 138. But have you had a look through those and some of them, and what are the big ones that stand out for you?
The recommendations, the ones that leapt out at me, were the Royal Commission has almost laid a whole minefield, basically, for the government to try and get through, because it's basically saying that some of these issues that have been dismissed or blocked or buried for years should go before the courts. Not only that, the victims should get the top-level legal advice, and it should be paid for. And furthermore, if they take something to court, they should basically go to the front of the queue. The victims get a chance to basically write the law, essentially, because it's going to be pretty cut and dried that if they take a case against the Crown based on these findings, what's the Crown going to do? It can't defend them anymore. And so that's going to basically set a precedent, it's going to set case law, and it's actually going to act, in my view, as a deterrent to the Crown. Don't do this again, because here's the bar, here's what the punishment will be.
Okay, so that's some of the key recommendations you've seen. I've also heard there's a long list of people that should give apologies, right?
I mean, my colleague just pointed out to me there's a whole list of public servants. I'm just trying to find it here, Solicitor Generals, Attorney Generals. I mean, these public service commissioners. There were people at the very highest level were involved in what, I think in plain language you could call a cover-up. And you can't tell me that it's the job of a government official or lawyer to cover up for paedophiles. I don't think that's in anybody's job description.
I've also heard there's, the Pope's listed as a person that should give an apology.
Yeah, well, let's start at the top. I mean, I don't know if that'll ever happen. I mean, get in the line, because, there's been calls for the Pope to apologise for quite a bit.
There's a lot of content here, obviously, and it'll take us weeks, if not months, or even years to digest all of this. But as an overview, if followed, do you believe that, if the government follows these recommendations, it'll actually make a real difference?
Yes. I think the first thing it possibly needs to do, and I'm not picking on this government because there's been plenty of other governments that have been going down this path for a long time, they need to actually just down tools and reconsider a whole lot of the policies that they've been running around talking about, and some of them are nothing more than election slogans.
Boot camps, I guess.
Boot camps. All the whole rhetoric about taking patches off gangs.
We will ban gang patches and insignia in public.
Okay, you're going to take the patch off them. Are you going to take away all the trauma of what happened to them in their childhood. You know, I think we need to sit back and take a look at this and think, we've been doing this for a very long time to thousands of individuals, and we seem to keep doing it. The Independent Children's Monitor found that there were 519 children had been abused in state custody last year, most of them more than once. The Crown, I have no particular view on which government, because they've been as bad as each other, needs to stop. It needs to stop doing it. It needs to clean house. If a government minister sits down and reads this whole report, they're going to have to rethink everything, because we're dealing with trauma on a massive scale. And I think all of the government departments are going to have to rethink health, corrections, the criminal justice system, all of it.
I mean, just on some of those policies that the government has at the moment, I mean, how can we ensure some of those, you know, the boot camps that's been talked about all the time at the moment, you know, won't ramp up into the problems we've had before? I mean, do you think we can use the evidence of this report to make sure that it doesn't happen again?
Well, we can. That's if they're willing to. I think there just needs to be some cross-party agreement that, hey guys, we can't use this as a political football all the time.
The current government obviously didn't call for this inquiry. It was a Labour government under Jacinda Ardern who called for it, and the last National government weren't very interested in doing this inquiry.
Why won't you look back and investigate and inquire into what happened to the 100,000 children in state care and government homes in the last 40 years?
Look, it's possible, certainly possible to do that. The question is whether it adds to...
So you will?
Well, no, we haven't said we will. The question is whether it adds to what is going to change.
So do you think that the current National-led government will actually listen?
Oh, look, I don't know. I wish I could say yes. I mean, this is what I can't quite fathom, is that did they bother to listen to any of the evidence that was coming out in the hearings? Did they read any of the interim reports?
I think Matt Ducey got in trouble for potentially not reading one, right?
The Prime Minister is defending the government's attitude towards survivors of abuse as it emerges one of his ministers did not read a report into the abuse of a group of survivors he met. Mental Health Minister Matt Ducey was sent the report personally in November, but at a meeting with abuse survivors in May, admitted he had not read it.
But did he read any of the others? I mean, there's Lake Ellis. I mean, he's in charge of mental health. And so we seem to have this national amnesia that we've been doing these things for so long, just put them on repeat every election cycle. It's like Groundhog Day. We just keep screwing it up. I mean, I found a cartoon it's the official history of the Department of Social Welfare, and there's a cartoon mocking the idea, it's from 1958, mocking the idea that sort of military-style discipline is going to straighten these gang members out.
And hopefully this report, with this wealth of information that we have, will help us get away from that amnesia.
You know, it's adults that harmed these children. Maybe the adults in the room need to actually grow up and look at this and the catastrophe that it has caused to so many lives, and do something that's going to protect the next generation of children from this ever happening again. The Adoption Act 1955 was the act I was adopted under. At the time, 1971, there was no DPB.
Was that a benefit? Sorry, what was the DPB?
Domestic purposes benefit. And so, without going into my birth mother's decision, you know, that was the sort of norm, I guess, for many single teenage mothers. Which was my birth mother's situation. So my birth mother was Pākehā, my birth father's Māori, and on my grandparents' part there was a bit of a negative attitude towards my birth father. How much that was the deciding factor, I don't know. But certainly then in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, you had couples applying to adopt were Pākehā predominantly, and most of them didn't want a Māori child. The other factor that was going on there from a legislation point of view is that the 55 Act basically ruled out traditional Māori adoptions. Māori whānau were generally not consulted if their child was, or their mokopuna was being put into the system. And so, anyway, I ended up with a Pākehā couple who brought me up, good parents, did everything they could. and did everything you'd expect from a parent. But they knew and recognised from quite early on that there was this big question mark, and they didn't quite get me because I was different to them. They tried to give me, I guess, my identity. At one stage, I went to St. Stephen's, which is a Māori boarding school.
Up in Auckland, right?
Yeah, and that was, I guess, their attempt to give me something that they couldn't. That only really exacerbated the issue, because going through your teens, you're trying to figure out who you are. And I was sort of with a bunch of guys, many of them were sort of tūhoi or from areas where they knew who they were very clearly and spoke Māori fluently, some of them. And so that just underlined that I didn't know anything. One of the main events that happened was I got a phone call out of the blue about 15 years ago now from a woman who I didn't know saying, "Hi, I'm Tanya. I think I'm your sister."
Wow.
That was obviously a pretty momentous event, and we've become very close since then. But in trying to kind of get to grips with that, I stood back as a journalist and said, well, how did this happen? And one of the things I found when I looked for answers on that was that when I was born and when she was born, the couples applying to adopt generally didn't want Māori children. And I found that pretty hard to stomach. I found it quite hurtful, actually, and caused me to ask a number of wider questions. Well, okay, does that attitude still persist today? And why is it that it's Māori boys? What's wrong with Māori boys? So that led me to ask a whole lot of questions around Māori boys, Māori men, and if you look at any social statistic, they're at the bottom. And the bigger problem is that we seem to be okay and comfortable with that as a society, and I wasn't. Now, that led me to look into issues like the numbers of Māori in prison. During that story, there were a number of people told me about these welfare homes and mentioned that as a contributing factor, and I didn't really click. And it wasn't until Lizzie Stanley's book, she's a criminologist at Victoria University, her book, The Road to Hell, which is about the abuse of children in state custody, and that gave some numbers and put some numbers around it. Her estimations were at least around 100,000. Most of them were Māori. And the Royal Commission has since found the numbers are higher than that. And so that's when the penny dropped for me, that this is a whole issue that we have really ignored. Australia looked into the stolen generations in the mid-90s, and for some reason we've been trying to bury it for the last 30 years. And if you look at and compare what's happened in Australia, Canada, the numbers are actually worse here.
So you found these facts, and then you found some people that had experienced this abuse in these institutions, right? How did you find these people to talk to who told you these stories? Well, yeah, here's the interesting thing. One of the people I spoke to for the story I did on prisons was a mongrel mob member, Edge Tawhaiti. And so when I started to look into the welfare homes, I rang him and said, do you know anybody who's been through? And it wasn't hard for him to find someone. He referred me to a guy, Francis McLaughlin, and his brother had gone through, and that was the first story I did, was with his brother Jimmy. And was that for Radio New Zealand, was it? It was, yeah. Jimmy was one of the people I spoke to in that story, but I did a broader narrative, I guess, around the efforts that the Crown had gone to bury it for, as I say, a good 20, 30 years. It was fortuitous, I guess you could say. Kim Hill was on Morning Report that morning, and it was her interview that really, I guess, blew it up. She interviewed Anne Tolley. And Tolley rang a good couple of minutes before the 7:30 news, hoping, I suppose, to be saved by the bell. And Kim got onto a roll, and the producer pushed the news off a cliff and let her go.
An apology and an independent inquiry then. That would be good, wouldn't it?
Well, we don't need an inquiry now. What we need is the claims recognised, the state to take responsibility for that, apologise to them so that they can move on with their lives. If we start now for a major inquiry, then they have to relive that all again. Why would we put them through that all again? These claimants have suffered enough at the hands of the state. Do we really want to do that to them again?
I think that if they want an independent inquiry, they're entitled to have one.
There'd been media coverage before. I wasn't the first journalist to cover it. There was, right back in the 70s, there was very good coverage, but it sort of tended to peter out and nothing much would change. It just got traction at that particular point. There were a number of people who had been advocating for an inquiry. My coverage just gave that a little bit of a nudge and got the inquiry over the line.
Anne Tolley was the Minister for what at that point?
She was the Minister for MSD under the National Government.
I mean, how many people have you talked to about this?
I would say I've probably spoken to at least dozens, and that for some of them there's probably a group of maybe 6 to 10 that I've spent a lot of time with and spoken to at length, but then there's a lot of people that I have spoken to off the record or just in conversation.
Yeah, well, just give me an example, Aaron, about on one of these people and how they got into these institutions in the first place and all the stories they told you about the abuse they suffered.
One of the people that I spoke to very early on was a guy by the name of Tyrone Marks. He came from a large family who grew up in Hastings. There was no abuse as such going on. You could possibly say neglect. They weren't well off. But he doesn't recall any abuse of any kind. And he recalls a social worker, I use this word, but basically enticing him into her car on the promise of buying him some shoes. And he didn't get any shoes. He was taken to the airport in Napier and flown down to, first of all, it was a school in Nelson, a Catholic school. He was, I think, 6 or 7 at the time, and didn't know what was happening to him and started acting up immediately. And he then got sent to a place called Campbell Park, which was incredibly abusive. There was what you could only describe as paedophiles that were on the staff there. Again, his behaviour deteriorated. He was sent up to other institutions in the North Island. He went through most of the institutions, Kohitere, Hokio, Epuni. He ended up at Holdsworth, which is another one of the welfare homes. Again, there was abuse right through. And then the same guy that had been at Campbell Park, John Drake, ended up at Holdsworth. And Tyrone and a bunch of other kids ran away, stole some bikes, and he got run over in the process of trying to head for the hills, I guess. After getting out of hospital, he had some serious injuries. He got run over and the car went over the top of him. He then got sent to Lake Alice, which is at the time was a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. It was the, I guess, maximum security before we had Parry Max. And you had criminally insane adults there, and they were sending children there. And that was run, that unit, the adolescent unit, was run by a guy, Dr. Selwyn Leeks. Now, the Royal Commission has found that what Dr. Leeks was doing to those children was torture. He was electrocuting kids, not just on the head, on the body parts, on genitals. And I like to compare it to Abu Ghraib. If you compare it to Abu Ghraib, it's worse. And so there were around 300 children that went through that unit. Most of those he went through those welfare homes with, would end up in jail, would end up in gangs. And especially in the 70s, you can see, and this is what I picked up from very early on, that this was the trajectory for a lot of these guys, that the ones that you found in jail in the sort of 80s, 90s and into the 2000s had started in these institutions. Everything I've heard, the Royal Commission's obviously heard the same from far more people. And then they've got all this access to all these other documents that, they could get into the detail of what was going on at the institution at the time. It was this relief to see that the victims, that it's not their stories, it's their lives, have been validated, their experiences have been validated, heard, believed, and are now in this official document. And so this will be, I think, a marker and a reference point for a long time to come. But I do think this is now, I don't know about a weapon, but it is a tool, at the very least, that victims and advocates for victims can use to really, hopefully, drive some change, because it's well overdue.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Today's episode was engineered by Ben Pearce. It was produced by Gwen McClure, Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thanks to Aaron Smale. I'm Tom Kitchen. Mā te wā.